Hello and welcome to the second part of the series, Heritage and Hope, a history of the Presbyterian Church in Florida, based on a book by the same name from Reverend Dr. James Bullock, retired minister in Jacksonville. Today's part goes from the Civil War through World War II. Now, the Civil War brought with it the Gardner Springs Resolution. Before the Civil War, there was one Presbyterian church in America. But this amendment says the General Assembly, making some expressions of their devotion to these United States and their loyalty to the government. Well, of course, that meant to the federal government. The southern states took exception to bringing in the political statement. This one in particular, pledging their loyalty to the state, and framed it in theological terms that the loyalty belongs to God. So the Presbyterian Church split. During the war, you have Presbyterians fighting. In fact, during the Battle of OLUSTEE, Presbyterian women from Gainesville were bringing troops to water. And when they were bringing the water to these wounded Confederate soldiers, their husbands, their brothers, their sons, they took fire from Union soldiers. In the Battle of Tallahassee, you have cadets from the militarized presbytery, the seminary west of the SUWANEE, and they fought to maintain Tallahassee as the only Confederate capital not to fall to the Northern armies. Now, Tallahassee did suffer, though. Minister John DuBose turned his home into a hospital. He lost his wife and 2 kids to illness and was considering suicide. But Reconstruction soon followed. The PCUS was now separated fully from the PCUSA. They were founded in 1965 as the Southern Presbyterian Church. And of course, they maintained that they were absolutely right to split off from the PCUSA for use of a political stance within the church. New churches were founded in Gainesville, 1867, Clearwater Harbor, in 68, and Dunedin. Left in this picture, you see Epworth Hall in Gainesville, part of the East Florida Seminary. And to the right, you see the Dunedin Andrews Memorial PC, which now does business as a wedding chapel. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, an abolitionist, was a Presbyterian, and she and her husband retired to Mandarin, Florida. Mandarin, of course, as we recall from the deep freeze in the 1830s, did not have a Presbyterian church, and even though her husband was a Presbyterian minister, no church was founded during her time in Mandarin. But Reconstruction also brought to the forefront other Presbyterians. This one, Reverend Jonathan C. GIBBS, he held his services at a church in Jacksonville, Laura Street Presbyterian Church. This man was a Princeton graduate and the first Secretary of State for Florida, black or white, under the new Constitution. Also became the Superintendent of Public Instruction and was one of the signers of the Florida Constitution. Being a Presbyterian and a Princeton-educated man, he held a lot of sway, and this was absolutely remarkable considering the opportunities available to black men at that time. Now, one of his quotes is, "A man in this state cannot do his whole duty as a minister except he looks out for the political interest of his people." Another prominent Presbyterian, William McCormick, a preacher at Gainesville. He worked to round up destitute Presbyterians in the area. After formation of the Synod of South Georgia and Florida, he preached the inaugural sermon. and the first report to the Synod deplored the spiritual desolation of Florida. With a shortage of ministers and rapid population growth, it asked unofficially for financial help from the PCUSA. Could not talk to them in broad daylight. Jacksonville was a booming town, but something was happening to this frontier town. There was no longer a single case of disorder or misdemeanor. Bibles and hymnals are better protection than pistols or bowie knives. A big difference 30 years made in this city. 1883. The PCUS and PCUSA finally had to come to terms. And among them is not opening churches where there's already a functioning church. They would not compete for the same areas, send missionaries to the same places, and local congregations would pick one or the other. But an evangelist had to consult with the office before selecting a new mission field or new town. This was to preserve both, as Presbyterians could join the local church. Splitting the congregations they had in two would have been detrimental to both organizations. 1882, heresy was around. James Woodrow of Columbia Seminary called to give full views as they respect to the world, lower animals, and man. Yes, that's right, the Scopes Monkey trial, and it was happening to our seminarians. So what kind of challenges did we face in the 1890s? Well, the church actually doesn't seem too different. Finance was a problem, stewardship was a problem, and they also had the education and evangelization of free blacks, which became an issue. Now, for all the talk they gave it, we have to conclude that it was entirely lip service. They set aside in the budget $76.01 from the Florida Presbytery, $63.12 from the SUWANEE, and by 1912 there was no money in the budget at all. Other Presbyterians were making their mark in the state. Henry Flagler, a Presbyterian, got his wealth from Standard Oil and became a railroad tycoon in Florida with the East Coast Railroad. He's also known as the father of Miami and the founder of Flagler College in St. Augustine. His railroad industry brought oranges from Florida up north for the winter. Became a favorite gift for Christmas baskets up north. Also, those trains brought tourists. They came down to his resorts, and he would take them down to Miami to wait out the winter. Education. Presbyterians have long been on education, and in the early 1800s, there was the Leon Academy in Tallahassee. Then, from the Leon Academy in Tallahassee, you also had the seminary west of the SUWANEE in 1857 to 1863. During the Civil War, it became the Florida Military and Collegiate Institute, which helped to defend the city. And there are 3 national football championships from 1902, 1903, and 1905 in Tallahassee for the seminary west of the SUWANEE, which ultimately became known as the Florida State University. But in 1905, they moved the men to Gainesville, and then it became the Florida Female College. Ultimately later, Florida State University. But just so you're aware, that is 3 national championships in addition to the 3 that came after 1993. Then you have the seminary east of the SUWANEE, 1853, when it became the University of Florida, at which point the men went there, and they didn't have another national championship for 100 years. Now, then you have other social social movements going on. The Women's Christian Temperance Movement. They were ultimately responsible for bringing about prohibition in the United States. In the American Anti-Saloon League, drinking was known to be a problem, and they wanted to make sure no one was doing it. Now, the PCUS, at the time, the church in Florida, they also looked into the issue. Now, they tried to do something about it, but did not want to sign on to political movements. The last argument they had about political movements was the Gardner Amendment, which split the church in two. So they refused to give support to the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. However, they still did condemn the evils of drinking. Now, in World War I, before Prohibition, they still tried to stop drinking. In fact, they had an amendment and put forth a motion to the U.S. government to at once take steps as will be effective in putting a stop to this economical waste, that we may be better able to feed properly all at home and all our allies abroad, and thereby win this great struggle. Women's rights were also coming to the forefront. Now, early on, of course, men were elders and women were not, and they had some debates about these. And one of the quotes: "Public speaking in the promiscuous assembly of the congregation or church is contrary to the holy oracles, and therefore should be prohibited and condemned by the presbyteries and church sessions." So women would not speak in mixed company. Well, in 1915, the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Union formed, and they wanted to support mission work in the world. Well, what they were told was they had to confine their activities to education, inspiration, and their financial contributions would be handled through the regular channels. In other words, they were free to raise as much money as they wanted, and the elders of the church, the men, would decide how that money is spent. There was a red-letter day in the history of the Bee Ridge Presbyterian Church. In 1918, they paid off their mortgage. The very next day, the church burned to the ground. Then you get into the 1920s, and you've got some groundbreaking activities going on for women's rights. In 1924, Mrs. H.A. Love was permitted to read a report out loud in mixed company at the Florida Synod, the first synod who allowed a woman to speak in mixed company in the U.S. In 1925, the Conference of Black Women at Hunksford Normal School, Eatonville, Florida, was brought on by Miss Thompson under direct threat from the KKK, not wanting to mix races. Well, the women braved it and opened that conference and held it without incident, even under direct threat from the Ku Klux Klan. The 1920s, of course, were also the scene of a great deal of homelessness, a lot of people out of work. There was a migrant camp in Belle Glade, Florida, and the Sarasota Church served them through meals, through clothing drives, and things of the sort, doing a big public outreach to all the migrants who came down here on the trains just to survive the winters. In the 1940s, you saw the first attempts by the PCUS and PCUSA to reunify, but it was still a problem. The PCUSA rejects the motion to have separate black and white presbyteries. They saw we were going to have one presbyteries for a region, one synod for a region, and they would not segregate it to keep the black churches separate. Well, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this part of the series. The next third installation is the 1940 through the present day.